We are seeing something yesterday, you saw something about candomblé, some things about how Bahia is more Africanized carnival than Rio de Janeiro, right? In Bahia, this carnival, this what do you call emphasis in the drumming is called batucada. So that's why he said the age of batucada, or the era of batucada, and that's what he writes about. He used oral history and lots of sources from newspaper to collect this material. Many people study Carnival in Brazil, but they mostly emphasize in Rio de Janeiro.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, I'm good. How are you? I love the glasses.
Yeah, I need to read, so. These are my students. They are going to be right here. You look at here, people, here, not to the screen. He works with oral history. He works with newspaper and other medias as he studies Carnival and black culture in Bahia. And the other thing is that he's this type of modern, cool teacher that has blogs and Facebook pages and Twitters and everything, so you can communicate with him. We have been studying Carnival. I acknowledge that we spoke more about Rio, though I tried to introduce you a little bit about Bahia. And today he's going to discuss his text, The Era of Batucadas. So he's going to discuss with you a little bit about the difference between Bahia and Rio and what happened in Salvador during the Carnival between 1930s and 1940s until get to the 1950s. All right?
Sounds good.
So now it's with you.
So Elaine and I didn't really work out exactly how this is going to roll, but I've written a few paragraphs to just kind of start us off, get us warmed up. I wrote it this afternoon after she mentioned that you guys were working on various themes within Carnival, and also thinking about comparisons between Carnival in Rio and Carnival in Salvador, and that those comparisons, I think, those are really good choices because you can see that in Rio things are a little bit more like this or like that, and in Salvador things are a little bit more like that and like this. And so that comparative perspective is going to be, I would think, quite instructive for people coming to Carnival in Brazil for the first time. But of course, you all have your own Carnival cultures. I understand half of your classes has fled to Trinidad to participate in the activities there. So you actually got third and fourth and maybe fifth points of reference as well. So I'd like to start out by pointing out that this year's theme in Salvador for its Carnival, which is its final night, is tonight, of course. The theme in Carnival is, it's different, it's Carnival in Salvador. É diferente, é Carnaval de Salvador. And what they're highlighting as different is Salvador's African heritage. And in particular, the whole event has been structured as a homage to the blocos afros, or the African blocks. I think maybe you've talked about these. I'm not sure. But the African blocks, the blocos afros, they were founded in 1974, and it's their 40th anniversary. And so Salvador's making a big thing about this year. The blocos afros, if you don't know, they use percussion. They embrace African or Afrocentric themes. Ile, which was the original bloco, they've had a Black Beauty Queen contest for decades now, and they didn't allow white people to join, although white people could sort of provide support. Many of the blocos afros, they often announce messages that are anti-racism, anti-discrimination, multicultural, and inclusive. And the emergence of these messages and of the blocos afros themselves was influenced by the Black Power movement in the United States in the 1960s, and was also a response to racism and discrimination in the Salvadoran context, and also cultural marginalization. Okay, so this year, to celebrate the blocos afros, the main carnival circuit, which in Salvador there's two circuits that create the main carnival, and that's where the trio electricos go around, stop and sing songs, and everybody dances and gets excited, and then the trio electrico carries on, and then another trio electrico will sort of come in its place. Now these of two circuits, one of them this year has been dedicated to the Blocos Afros. In the past, it was only the main, so commercially viable, already established national groups and bands who were on this main circuit. And the Blocos Afros were sort of relegated to lesser circuits, and so to the city center, for example, where they could parade, or official but smaller circuits that weren't the big ones. Okay, but this year they're getting their own half of the main circuits. Okay, now I mention this because of the obvious parallels to the batucadas in the 1930s and 1940s, and the fact that the dominant culture then, before and after World War II, preferred to control the main circuits with their corteges, their elite clubs. And this was a symbolic way to reinforce the elite vision of Salvador, which was a vision that, in their view, would at the very best marginalize Salvador's African heritage and perhaps sort of be rid of it altogether, perhaps as an eventual desire. Okay, it was only the as you read the article, it was only the economic problems of the elite that allowed space for the batucadas, at which point the press somewhat started to fawn over them, also a handful of academics, intellectuals, and authors as well, and consequently both the members of the batucadas as well as these journalists both contributed to deepening the association of Bahia with its African heritage. And that's one of the main points, main contributions of the article, is to show, to fill in this gap between the 19th century and the later 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s in Salvador. Okay, and this kind of cross-cultural alliance, this kind of combination of batucada agency and also the journalists, that's another sort of parallel between this year's carnival focus and the emphasis on the Blocos Afros, because the media around Salvador's carnival this year is all about the Blocos Afros. And a final parallel, to kind of pull all this together and get at some of the larger themes, we have the constant give and take of Bahian cultural politics. In Salvador, efforts by working class and or Afro-Bahians to improve their station in society has often been carried out through culture. This is different from the more, say, explicitly political efforts of the civil rights movement in the United States to combat segregation in the South, or it's also different from the explicitly economic efforts, particularly in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, but also in Bahia somewhat to a degree as well, to use racial quotas for university admissions to offset legacies of informal racial discrimination in hiring practices, in access to loans, and especially access to education. So Afro-Bahians have typically used culture as a means to claim greater social inclusivity. One could call this sort of a greater sense of citizenship, cultural citizenship, in fact. Okay. Which brings us to a big question, of course, and that's how does this sort of cultural mainstreaming, cultural cooptation, if you will, help to extend greater political and economic power to the working class and working poor? It's focusing on culture enough, and in part answer, being partly provocative. I'll just point out that next year's carnival, the Blocos Afros are going to be relegated off the main circuits and put back in what some might see as their rightful place. So is cultural politics enough? And I'll leave that question unanswered, and I'd really enjoy the discussion and hearing your opinions about it.
Thank you very much. Now we are going to discuss with you some of the features of your text. And I'm going to open this because my students are very shy. See? Well, I was as I was reading, I was comparing your studies with something that I wrote. I read about the candomblé in Salvador around the same time, and how the terreiros were being, invaded and destroyed and something. We have this big connection that we can see, visual connection between those blocos Afro or those Afoxé or Bloco Afro, some connection with the candomblé. But you didn't mention much of the candomblé in your text, so I want to know what was going on at the same time in the 1930s and 40s with this part of the culture, because I know there is a connection, and the black community is much more in candomblé than other religions, especially batucada is directly related to candomblé.
Okay, I really mostly only heard sort of the last half of the question. It took me a little while to get the timbre of the microphone coming through my computer speakers. But what I gather you're after is you'd like me to talk a little bit more about what's happening in the terreiros in the 30s and 40s, and how what's happening in the terreiros is also sort of contributing to the cultural politics of the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Exactly.
Correct?
Yes.
Okay, exactly. Okay. The batucadas and what you read about is really one small part of a wider change after 1930 in Salvador, whereby people of African descent and people who practiced cultural practices that were part of the African heritage, so not just candomblé, but also capoeira and samba, were all understood as cultura negra. And Salvador witnessed after 1930 quite a big change in the level of acceptance of candomblé, of capoeira, and of samba. And you can chart this, and this is in fact what I've done in the wider project, which is all in this book.
We have it.
Which I'm not showing to sell it to you, I'm just showing you that the batucada is one sort of sliver of all the changes that are happening between, nice one, thank you, okay, between 1930 and 1954. And the story basically goes something like this. Is that after 1930, a small handful of, sort of middle-class intellectuals, journalists, authors, some of whom were Afro-Bahian, others were not, some of whom would go on to become quite famous, like Jorge Amado, others would not, like Edison Carneiro. They started to pay more attention to Afro-Bahian cultural practices. At the same time, Afro-Bahians themselves, particularly in the community of candomblé, started to use this attention and these individuals as a way to push for religious acceptance. And so their issue was that even though there was a constitution of 1889 that granted freedom of religion, candomblé was still persecuted in the 1920s and the 1930s. Also, capoeira was still persecuted in the 1920s, in particular in Salvador, although that was more down to the personality of a particular police chief who's gone down in lore of capoeira. And samba was kind of here and there. It was a fad for a time among elites, but it was mostly seen as a sort of a coisa dos negros, okay, sort of a black thing. So the candomblé community actually began to organize and began to push for religious equality. And some of their help came from somebody like Edison Carneiro, whose dad was a school teacher. He was Afro-Bahian himself. He was largely self-taught. He was a member of the Communist Party. He was not so much a practitioner of candomblé, but he was very much aware of the importance of candomblé to the wider Afro-Bahian working class community. And so he championed it. And in fact, when he got in trouble with the police a little while during Getulio Vargas's Estado Novo dictatorship, one of the places he hid out was in a terreiro of Candomblé. That was in 1937, 1938. So this push on the part of this sort of cross-class alliance, as I call it in the book, began to have an effect. And it partly began to have an effect because national trends were also changing in Brazil. And this is something you've already noticed, learned from your study of Carnival. But in Rio de Janeiro, how Getulio Vargas is using samba and carnival to help create and consolidate a national identity. And the Bahia at the time are watching these great changes in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Their roads are getting paved, they're getting more electricity, their swamps are being drained, major industries are sort of emerging in Sao Paulo, there's massive urbanization, immigration. It looks like the Southeast has really got something right and they're moving ahead, whereas Bahia was still very traditional, still very stuck, based around agriculture. There wasn't much industry to speak of apart from a flour mill, a chocolate factory, bottled water, beer factories, things like that. So the Bahian elite begin to see that, well, they don't have much economic currency, but they might have, they do have this cultural currency, which seems to be quite valuable now under Getulio Vargas in the Southeast. So it's clear that politicians in Bahia, as well as journalists, as well as Candomblé community, all start to reshape Bahia's regional identity and reshape the notion of Bahia and Bahianness, Baianidade, as being inclusive of Bahia's African Bahian cultural practices. And so it's important, I think, to get back to Elaine's point, to stress what's happening in the terreiros, that they're part of this. It's not quite sure who's using who. That's it's hard to get at people's motivations, but clearly the Candomblé community is involved in this. In the context of Carnival, just very briefly to kind of finish, in the context of Carnival, not only do you have the emergence of the batucadas, but you also have, which isn't mentioned in the article at all, the afoxés. And an afoxé is defined as Carnaval da Rua, right? Candomblé da Rua. So it's Candomblé that can move out into the streets and can sing, follow, and dance to particular rhythms, but they aren't the secret rhythms of Candomblé. They're rhythms that are appropriate for public consumption. And these afoxés were always part of Carnival. And after 1930, and in particular, in the 1930s, we start to see kind of a rise in the number of afoxés, but more importantly, that the newspapers start to talk about the afoxés, and often in very positive ways. And so, again, like the batucadas, you have people themselves insisting on being part of this wider phenomena, Salvadoran Carnival, which helps define what Bahianness actually means. Does that help
a lot
fill that gap a little bit?
Yes, thank you. There is another question here. I will pass you to the student.
Hi, good evening. I just have one question dealing with how was this really affected during the military dictatorship in the 70s and 80s?
How did things change? How does this play out during the military dictatorship in the 70s and 80s? Yeah. My research goes up until 1954. 54, 55. That's the end of the Vargas era. Then there's 10 years between 54 and 64, which is called, it's actually 45 to 64, which is called the democratic experiment. This is when, between two military dictatorships. We don't know an awful lot yet about what's happening with Carnival in Salvador in the 50s and in the 60s. That's possibly a next project for me, possibly a project for one of you, should you decide to become a Brazilian historian. Well, what we do know starts in the 70s, in the mid-70s. And in 1974, 1974, it's this founding of this Bloco Afro Ilieae, which comes out of a couple factors. Number one is the discrimination that the black middle class in Bahia was feeling as their economy started to grow under the military dictatorship. So the military dictatorship put in lots of policies that expanded the economy in the Northeast, in particular around petrochemicals and industry. This meant that there was lots of managerial jobs opening up, and a black middle class began to emerge because there was also technical education. It was being sponsored by the state. And so you were creating engineers and civil servants and people that could work in these industries, but they didn't feel they were getting hired. They felt there was discrimination. And so one of the ways that they responded to that discrimination was through Carnival. And by looking at Carnival and saying, there is no cultural space for our African heritage. And in fact, there's very little space for Afro-Bahians themselves. We're going to create a space by creating these Blocos Afros, not out of nothing, but out of a residual culture of the Batucadas and of the Afoxés that were sort of reaching this peak in the 30s and 40s. And everything tails off the 50s, 60s, and then Ilieae, and then Olodum started off. The relationship between those cultures, cultural associations, and the dictatorship is... I'm just trying to think of how much literature there is on it. I don't think there's an awful lot of literature on it, partly because it really came down to whether the government was going to support it or repress it. And in the case of Salvador, the dictatorship there wasn't... By 1974, most of the leftists and the subversives were either jailed, had fled, or were actually killed. By 1974, even the countercultural movement had kind of peaked and waned. You know, that's Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil. So in Bahia, there wasn't this sense of threat. And in fact, Antonio Carlos Magalhães and other people who were sort of really important in the Bahian faction of the dictatorship were rather welcoming of Ilieae and the Blocos Afros. So and you have to wonder why that was. I mean, was it only because they didn't see a threat? Was it because they saw an opportunity to maybe co-opt people, to build up their own legitimacy? Because 80% of Salvador is of some degree of African descent. So it's a good question. It's something that's not particularly well studied.
Okay, thank you very much.
Now, we have another question here.
Right. I was wondering if you could talk to us about the role the media played in changing the image of Carnival in Bahia.
Yeah, fantastic question. Do you mean during the period that I studied? Or do you mean, yeah. I find that the whole... This gets into, you know, the whole historian and his or her source base and what you can actually tell from, say, newspapers, for example. But just to sort of start the ball rolling, the role of the media, in my view, is super important in reshaping or help reshape the discourse around cultura negra and the discourse of Bahianness and Bahianidade. And that's partly because that was what the middle class read. That's what the dominant culture, the dominant class read. And so it was effectively them talking to each other, and you could see this increased attention and celebration of the media. At the same time, Salvador's newspapers were quite left of center on social issues. They were quite conservative politically and economically, but there was three, and two of the three, and there was a fourth one, and there was also a communist newspaper as well, but they were much smaller circulation. 4 of these 5 newspapers were quite focused on the small clubs, quite focused on capoeira, quite focused on samba during the popular festivals, not just Carnival, but there's a whole series of Saints Days, Saints Festivals. It's a kind of a cycle that goes from early December all the way to Carnival. It kind of ends in Carnival. And there's 4 or 5 major events. And the press then becomes, a big figure in recalibrating the discourse of Bayani Daji. Where it gets a little bit more kind of challenging for the historian is how many people are reading this? What's the reception? Can we just talk about how do we gauge the impact over time? Also, if they're starting to talk about, if it looks like there's more affochés, for example, being talked about in the newspapers, is that because there are more affochés overall, or is that because the newspapers finally started paying attention to the affoché? So there's also some limits and some kind of methodological problems that such a reliance on the newspapers brings with it. But I felt overall the weight of evidence, even viewed critically, is pretty clear that there's an awful lot of there's a big shift going on between 30 and 64.
Thank you.
Do you want to follow up on that, or does that help enough? I mean, you can follow up. I mean, do you have an interest in the media? Is there a specific question that you had?
I was looking at it from the point of view of how the newspapers, etc., would have been able to change the perspective of Carnival in the minds of the middle class, because I know they probably had a negative view of it initially. But I'm thinking the media would have helped to play a role in changing that in their mind.
Yeah. No, I'm in agreement there. And even if they're not changing it, they are clearly reflective of a change that's going on anyway.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Sadie. I wanted to know what was the main period of your research.
The big project, as Elaine mentioned, I started out in Central American ethnohistory. I was actually much more focused on Spanish America. I lived in Guatemala for 6 months. I was going to do a study of the penetration of capitalism into the countryside in a Cachiquel-speaking community to the west of Guatemala City during a dictatorship in the 1930s and 1940s. When I started to get interested in Brazil, my future dissertation advisor said, wow, the intellectual interests that you have line up actually quite nicely with what's happening in Salvador da Bahia during the 30s and 40s. If you would want to switch, I could support you. You have to change your Spanish to Portuguese, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a long switch. But when I got to Salvador, I realized, yes, there was a dominant culture that was a dominant class culture, which was the minority. There was a series of sort of subordinate working class cultures that were in the majority. There was a dictatorship in the 30s. There was sort of an intensification of capitalism. So, wow, okay, so this does match up quite nicely with the questions I was asking about Guatemala. So I thought to do kind of a social history of leisure. I was really going to look not so much at culture, but at people and their lives outside of the workplace, and how those might have changed during this dictatorship and with the kind of penetration of capitalism, or the intensification of capitalism in the city. But when I read more about leisure and I started getting into the theory of leisure, and also after talking to Salvadorans, I realized that what they did for fun was, in their oral histories anyway, was very explicitly linked to Carnival, was linked to what they did during Carnival. It was linked to these other popular festivals. And the more I read and the more I talked to them, the more it became obvious that with leisure is bound up an awful lot of politicization and cultural politics. And that then pulls me deeper into the study of Carnival, the study of the other popular festivals. And as I looked through the various sources, did the oral histories, it came together in the type of argument that I present in the article that you guys read. So that's the my intellectual trajectory, if you will. I'm hoping that was the question.
Ah, okay. This middle class, did they have contact with the species of negritude of Cesar and Segon? The species of negritude that are going on in the Caribbean, as they started to defend this Afro-Bahia, this by African descendancy. This is deep. That is deep, deep water.
The part I understood of the question, and you're actually doing better without the microphone. That microphone just sends way too much tinginess into the whole thing. So I understood the first half of the question, which was, what does this Bahia middle class look like, right? Yeah, okay. So the Bahia middle class in the 30s and 40s hardly exists. You're almost talking about middle sectors rather than an actual middle class. But it's emerging, and it's quite mixed. There's a demographic phenomena in Bahia which effectively plays out like this, that there's so few people not of African descent, some degree of African descent, because there's a whole sort of continuum, as you know, that many of the middle class positions are going to be filled by people of some degree of African descent, whether they're majority, as the categories go, majority brown, majority mulatto, majority pardo, majority preto or negro. I don't think we have that statistical information. But people like Donald Pearson, who was a sociologist who was in Bahia in 1936, he constantly remarked on how the middle class could be quite mixed. The elite, however, were almost overwhelmingly of European descent. So that's what's happening in South or in the 30s and 40s. But then where it gets interesting is how many of the, let's call it sort of the black middle class, were also practicing capoeira. How many were going to candomblé? If they were going to candomblé, were they deeply bound up with it, or was it just kind of like a once a month show up sort of thing because that's the neighborhood you're in and they're having a festival and you go to see your friends, etc.? How many were joining the batucadas? Okay, not many were joining the batucadas. There would have been relationships with candomblé for sure. So it's complicated, and it's complicated in a wonderful sort of way.
Okay, the second part of
now, the second part of the
is about the intellectual influence of what was going on in the Caribbean. The influence of Cesar and this Neposegon. So this movement that is going on in the Caribbean at the same time, and I think in a certain extent also in Western Africa. Yeah. How does this discourse about Africanidade affected the speech of this middle class?
Yeah. Okay. That's. I heard Cesar about 4 times. I was pretty sure that's where this was going. Okay. In the 60s, then Brazil has quite an interesting relationship to African independence movements, and Brazil, on the one hand, supported the Portuguese during this time period. On the other hand, Brazil was keeping one eye on the potential markets of independent African nations. And so it wanted to play it both ways. Interestingly, the African nations themselves realized that Brazil was being quite hypocritical. They're backing the Portuguese during these anti-colonial movements. And so in 1973, when the OPEC nations want to set up the oil boycott to punish the West for its support of Israel, they approached African oil-producing nations to get them involved in the boycott. And what a number of African oil-producing nations said was, we'll only get involved in the boycott if you include Brazil in the boycott as well for what they were doing during our efforts to achieve independence. It's just quite an interesting moment there. Brazilians found out about this, the Brazilian State Department found out about this, and started launching discussions in order to kind of negotiate their way out of being stuck in the boycott, when they succeeded in doing that. There's a great book as well called Hotel Trópico, which written by Jerry Davila, which delves into Brazil's relationship with African independence and this idea of there being future markets in Africa. How this reverberated back to Bahia, again, this happens a little bit after the time period that I've studied, but I know that Leopold Senghor visited Bahia in, I think, 1963. I've got it somewhere. In 1959, the Federal University in Bahia set up its Afro-Asian Study Center. And when the Candomblé community sort of got wind that this was being set up, and the people that were setting up the center were involved in the community of Candomblé, there very quickly became a relationship between some of the higher-ranking priestesses and this institute within the university. And the Candomblé community started to push for Yoruba language classes as part of the offerings of the institute. And there was also then an exchange of personnel. So some of the personnel from Houses of Candomblé and the university went to Nigeria, and as I mentioned, Leopold Senghor and a number of others actually came to Bahia for these short visits. Beyond that, I can't, I'm trying to think of what I've read and who's looked at the intellectual influence in Bahia of Cesar, for example. And I think that we don't know a lot about it. We know a lot more about the influence in places like Rio and Sao Paulo. But in Bahia, I don't know. But I can look over the next few days, and if you give me your email, or Elaine sends me your email, I can actually give you a brief synopsis of what I find, because I'd like to know more about that myself.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Go ahead. Okay, I have another question for you.
Yeah.
How would you say that Carnival affected black entrepreneurship in Bahia in the 1930s? With the emergence of Carnival on a larger scale, how would you say it affected black entrepreneurship?
She's asking how the development of Carnival in a large scale after 1930s affected black entrepreneurship in Bahia.
This is a great question. How did Elaine? How did it affect it in Rio? Maybe if you talked a little bit about that, if we know anything about it. I mean, is that where she's getting the idea from something?
No, it's because you mentioned something in your text that the three big blue groups, they had support from the government. But the small clubs doesn't have anything. They have to deal themselves. They have to buy their fabric and hire seamstresses and makers. But there are other elements involved on that. There are the instruments, the fabrication of instruments, the manufacturing of instruments. You have all the aderezos, these things that they put in the hair. But there is a kind of business going behind that. And after 1940s, also you have some development of the tourism as well. And what Nikita wants to know is how this would create some sort of employment or entrepreneurship for black business people in Bahia. We know about the commerce of fabric between Brazil and the West Coast that would continue during the slavery, that would provide what they call panos da costa. And then I know that now they still use some elements from the African culture, but we want to know all about this.
The importation of West African goods, panos da costa and palm oil and things like that, that started to really die back in the 30s. As far as carnival costumes go, a lot of the more expensive stuff is all being imported. So this could have created spaces for importing and exporting, although I tend to think that that's something that would have been locked down by importers and exporters from previous decades. The actual sewing was almost all done by the individuals themselves. The men, if they were young enough, didn't have wives, in other words, they would often do it themselves. I think probably a lot of their wives would probably refuse to do it for them. They said, if you're going to go out and have fun with your friends on Carnival, you sew your own uniform. As far as the industry of Carnival, it was very, how should we say, it was very simple at the time. I mean, advertisements were very simple. There was advertisements for new Carnival hats. There was advertisement for, a sale for, a dress shirt during Carnival. There'd be advertisements for shoes, but these things aren't actually worn during Carnival. There'd be advertisements for the canisters of ether. Those would have been imported. I mean, there's obviously the buying of selling of food and drink, and I'm absolutely certain that created spaces for entrepreneurship, but that's a working class entrepreneurship, much more than a middle class entrepreneurship. I think it's a really good question, and I think if there would have been evidence and things would have come forward, then I would know more about it. So given that I don't, and I'm only speculating, I would just say this is one of the problems of Bahia's sources and being a historian is it's a very limited source base that you've got to work with, and hence the oral histories are more important. So again, I can look through the oral histories and see if there's some individuals discussing, how their entrepreneurial energies were channeled during Carnival. It's a good question.
Thank you. We have to finish now. Any other questions, final questions here?
How's the weather?
How's the weather where? In Florida? How's the weather over there? How's the weather there, for you?
Oh, the weather. It's hot. It's been in the 80s. Yeah, low 80s. We've had a lot of rain.
It's like here.
It's a little. Climate change has got me a little worried, I have to say.
How come you were not in the Carnival? She's asking that. I also have the question. How come you were not there?
I'm saving my. I was in Bahia in August and last October, but now I'm saving my money for the World Cup. We'll see if I can pull it off, but I thought it was worth missing Carnival to get to the World Cup.
You are back in Brazilian team, of course. He is.
Yeah, but I think I think you can't look past Brazil winning it. But I kind of like underdogs. So I'm sorry to say, for a long time I wanted Spain to win, and now they're winning, and I think it's time for Argentina.
Argentina.
I know. I'll never say that in Brazil. But I think if you're looking at the odds, the more interesting bets are going to be on Argentina. It's very hard for a European country to win in South America.
Okay, we are going to edit
if Brazil
this.
implodes, what?
We are going to edit this and cut the last part of your speech.
Yeah, no, you can do that. What's interesting is I think Neymar is going to get so much attention during the World Cup that Messi is going to get jealous, and he's going to get angry. And an angry and jealous Messi, and the fact that Argentina have a very easy group, could mean that there's a lot of momentum for Argentina. So it could get interesting. Your deadly rivals might actually cause problems for you.
There is another question that Nikita has, but she's shy to ask. I told them that you used to take students and study abroad. And she's asking if you are taking students to Brazil, if you include include some students from Barbados in your group?
I'm not taking students to Brazil, but through the University of South Florida, there is a program that's going, and it goes every year now, and it's run by, I'll send Elaine the details, it's run by Elizabeth Horge Freeman, who's a sociologist, and she does take students from other programs, from other universities. You just have to make sure your university accepts the credits, but it's possible. So I can send a link to that program. It's not just for USF students, so anybody can go. It'd be fantastic. Unfortunately, they're not going during Carnival or the World Cup, but...
As you said, there is always some festival going on in Bahia.
Exactly, and there's always a little bit of Carnival too, because, you know, Bahia has to be true to its festive spirit.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a very, very interesting experience, and you're very generous in accepting us to invade your evening at home. Thanks a lot.
I knew it would be fun. It was a lot of fun, and thank you very much. I'm sorry about the technical problems and not being able to hear very well, but I think we got through it.
Yeah, it was great. So, can you